you are trying to persuade people with power to do things that they are not sure they want to do. You have to sit on the red line between what's permitted and not permitted. If you're over the line, you lose your job. And if you're away from the line, you're not pushing hard enough.
You started working alongside Archbishop Tutu, Nelson Mandela in South Africa. So take us to that moment.
Anybody who's listening or watching should type in Archbishop Tutu laugh. He would pause and then he would just go, wah, ha, ha, and burst out into laughter. I will do any U2 song.
Is that because you're sponsored by Bono?
The struggle against apartheid, and then through to this period of the Truth Commission. What was it like personally? Did you feel fearful?
I started working for a young black lawyer, doing death penalty work, and he was assassinated.
So hang on, just to unpack that.
Yeah.
So doing death penalty work, and then he was assassinated. What are those?
Hi, I'm Hayaatun.
And I'm Matt.
And welcome to What We Don't Know, all about better leadership in a crazy, uncertain world.
And, you know, one of the foundations of being able to lead is to build trust, isn't it? And I'm really excited today that we're going to hear from somebody who's had to build trust in some of the most challenging situations you can imagine, when there's been a real betrayal of trust, relationships brutally fractured. And what does it take to rebuild trust when there have been horrendous human rights abuses? And this is the story of post-apartheid South Africa, truth and reconciliation, and looking forward to learning a huge amount from this story.
Yeah, I think we have a really unique guest today, actually. We have Paul van Zyl, who is a human rights champion and social entrepreneur. And he really does have an extraordinary CV. So he was born in apartheid South Africa. And I think, you know, that context was entirely formative and influential in terms of what he went on to do. So at really quite a young age, he became involved in the transition to a post-apartheid era. So 1994, when they had the first free democratic elections, Paul,
Mandela came to power. Yeah,
exactly, those scenes that those of us that are old enough will remember seeing on the TV. Absolutely gobsmacking, momentous scenes. And so one of the key elements of how South Africa navigated this incredibly sensitive and painful transition was through establishing a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And Paul ended up being the executive secretary to that, working alongside Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was the chair. And I think, you know, that really sowed the seeds for everything that Paul went on to do later in his life. So he eventually took that learning into founding the International Centre for Transitional Justice, and I think probably advised around 40 different countries on some of these incredibly, you know, painful moments where societies have to come together and find a new collective future from, you know, deep wounds, deep scars. And then he had a sort of second incarnation as a social entrepreneur, and he's won many awards. He studied in Johannesburg, in Leiden, in NYU in the US, and alongside some very eminent people. I hope we're going to get to ask him about that. And he's had awards like, he was a Skoll Foundation Fellow for Social Entrepreneurship, and also a young global leader at the World Economic Forum. And most recently, he founded the Conduit Club, which is a members club for people who are interested in social impact. So really, really eclectic and extraordinary CV.
Yeah, somebody who's come up with a way of doing something that was so incredible that he then was able to scale it to so many more countries. And now what his life work seemed to be lifting the next generation of social entrepreneurs. So a fascinating story and lots to learn.
Yeah, and he's going to work with some extraordinary leaders. I can't wait to see if he'll divulge what some of the behind-the-scenes experiences were like. Yeah. Because, in a way, these are sort of moments in history, things that we've seen on the telly. And I think it's always fascinating when you get to sort of peek behind the curtain.
Yeah, there's going to be some name-dropping in this episode. Mandela, Tutu, Kofi Annan, who knows?
I think you could have even more names to drop than you have, Matt. Let's see.
Let's have a competition.
Is that possible?
One of the things I'm interested to learn from Paul about is really how you build trust. And I think, you know, we know on a superficial level how to build trust with people being a bit vulnerable and so on. But when you've got relationships that are so fractured, emotions are running so high, he's been part of building processes across the world that can reconnect people at the most visceral level. And I think that's something few of us experience.
I think that's right. For me also, we live in a very divided society, and he's been right at the heart of helping navigate those divisions at key moments in societies and nations. And I wonder if there's something we can learn from him about how you do that in those times of almost crisis that you can then take into peacetime. I feel like we could do with some of that now.
I think something else about what Paul's done is they kind of developed a playbook for doing something that had never been done before. In South Africa, Truth and Reconciliation, so admired that he was then asked really to set up a way of doing that in lots of other countries that had suffered division. And he did it at such a young age. He was still a student when he was the executive secretary to Archbishop Tutu. So that's a fascinating story. And I wonder what it is that makes you tick to be able to do that with such diplomacy and yet such confidence.
Yeah, and I think actually probably that is the bridge, isn't it, between his initial career in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and working on these issues of transitional justice to his later career. He learned how to scale the learning, which is kind of what you do as a social entrepreneur. So that's going to be another theme that I'd like to pick at.
Yeah, and also as a leader to come up with something which then can happen at scale, how you inspire other people to do it. You can't just give them a sort of cookbook. You've actually got to inspire a set of behaviours and ways of listening as well as leading. And I often think those two things go together.
One of the things I really want to talk to Paul about is empathy. So you've heard me say this before. I am a huge believer that empathy is a very, very core element of the leadership playbook, and that some people kind of think of it as you're either empathetic or you're not, but I'm a big fan of the idea that you can actively cultivate and build empathy. You can grow your capacity to be empathetic in general, but actually also to be more empathetic with particular groups. Now, I imagine, I don't know this, but I imagine that when you are trying to create that sense of common purpose, common route forward through deep, deep, long-standing divisions, that focusing on building empathy is one of the tools that you use. So I'm interested to see if Paul recognises that, if you'd agree with that, and actually what practically he did or they did, if that is an important part of it. Because I think this is still an underplayed area when it comes to thinking about what good leadership looks like.
Brilliant. Yeah, I'm very intrigued by that. And I suppose my sort of parallel theory to your empathy theory is the sort of just listening and actively listening, which I think is probably a foundation of empathy.
Yeah, they're very connected, aren't they?
Really interested in that. And I suppose the other thing as well, there's something about when you're trying to build trust with people and there's maybe a power imbalance. I'm really interested in this. I think quite often a perception of a power imbalance or a seniority can get in the way of a human relationship. So I'd love to hear from Paul a bit about how did they get alongside the people they're trying to work with to build that trust, that empathy, that support, and enable conversations that must have been incredibly difficult for people to have with those that they feared and hated and have seen as being responsible for atrocities against them. How do you get alongside somebody and start to walk with them rather than try to lead from above?
Yeah, how do you flatten that power curve? That's super interesting. Actually, also sort of suddenly had a thought triggered. My dad came from South Africa. He grew up in apartheid South Africa. And his family were quite involved in the struggle against apartheid. And one thing he always said to me was take the emotion out of it. And of course, what you have to do when you are trying to do conflict resolution is to find a way to take the emotion out of it. So I wonder if that's part of why my dad always referred to that. And I'd be interested to see if Paul recognises that and whether that came into play in their discussions as well.
I'd love to meet your dad.
Explore.
Yeah, he sounds like a great. How you take the emotion out of something so difficult, that takes some real humanity and some skill, I guess.
Yeah, not to trivialise it, he was mainly telling me when I was
getting
over-exercised or crying when I was talking about something that really didn't merit it. So we weren't in quite a high-stakes environment, but it was actually a really important area that I worked on and benefited from. So yeah, let's see what we can discuss with Paul on that.
So, Paul, welcome. We're so excited to have you here. And I wonder if we could start by just diving straight in, because it's so remarkable at such a young age that you started working alongside Archbishop Tutu, Nelson Mandela in South Africa. So take us to that moment.
Well, I grew up in apartheid South Africa. I grew up as many typical white South Africans grew up, except for the fact that my parents, from the youngest age that I can remember, told me that apartheid was wrong and evil and ought to be resisted. But to be fair, they were both university academics, and I think their idea of resisting it was, have a jolly good debate, Oxford Union style, saying, this house believes that apartheid is evil. And I arrived at university and joined the student movement, the anti-apartheid student movement, and I thought, because I didn't know any better, that that's what it would be like. And I was instantly thrown into what a really brutal struggle against a really repressive and violent regime looked like. And the black students who were my colleagues were really at the cutting edge of it. And I started working for a young black lawyer, doing death penalty work, and he was assassinated.
So hang on, just to unpack that.
Yeah.
So doing death penalty work, and then he was assassinated. What are those? Tell us about those two things.
So we did this really fast. I was studying to be a lawyer. I was carrying his bag. And our theory of change was that you didn't try and say that people weren't guilty, because the people who were being prosecuted were resisting apartheid. They were clearly guilty. Our sole goal was to make sure that they didn't get capital punishment and executed, on the theory that if they got life imprisonment without parole, at some point change would come and they would be released. And he was assassinated because a hit squad sent him a Walkman with plastic explosives in the ears that blew off his head. And that's kind of radicalizing. And I then started working with his mother and a group of other mothers whose children had either been abducted, disappeared, or assassinated, and set up a group called Kule Manni, which in Zulu means speak out, which was basically just trying to say what happened, and we want truth and justice for what happened. And we built that group up from three people working in church basements to 3,000 people across the country. And then Nelson Mandela was released from prison. So going from a dark, evil regime, which was assassinating its opponents, suddenly you had one of the most remarkable leaders in the world. And Nelson Mandela had a really important leadership challenge, because it was clear that he was going to win the election and be South Africa's first democratically elected president, but he had to govern the country in a government of national unity with his opponents sitting across the cabinet table with him, but he also needed to deal with the atrocities that had occurred beforehand. And so the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established. And I had the luck and the foresight to, because I'd worked with victims and I was a plucky young lawyer, to help develop the policy and help write the law. And so when the commission was appointed, Archbishop Tutu asked me to serve as its executive secretary. So,
age? What sort of age are you then, Paul?
26.
It's extraordinary.
It's extraordinary. What a start into the working world.
Yes.
I think I want to just rewind, because I think we've got so much to talk about in this absolutely unique window of history that you were right at the heart of, Paul. So I want to make sure that we just kind of backpedal a bit further and understand, what your hinterland was. So 26 to be stepping into a role like that, that's extraordinary. When you look at yourself as, say, a teenager, would you have been surprised? Would you have been delighted at the life that you'd gone on to lead? Is it something that, you felt that kind of motivation to be an activist, to be a change maker already in those very, very early years? Or was that something that was sort of more a convergence of circumstance and, whatever it was in you that wanted to be doing something purpose-driven?
I think I was blessed by the fact that, from an early age, I remember hearing my parents, as I lay in bed trying to go to sleep, having rows with my grandparents about apartheid. And, my grandfather was a very prominent politician and served in the British military and went to Sandhurst and was sort of an establishment figure. And I was always the sort of apple of the family's eye because I was bright and did well in school and was articulate. And he always thought he would tuck me under his wing and take me off to public school, and I would be in a mini him. And when I went to university, I became a conscientious objector because the South African military recruited 100,000 white men every year. And I just said, I'm not a pacifist. I'm prepared to fight for what I believe in, but I'm not going to fight for a military that oppresses its own people. And my grandfather disowned me and didn't speak to me again till the day he died. And I wrote him a letter, and I sort of said to him, but Grandpa, you and I have always loved each other, and you went to war against the Nazis. I mean, I would be signing up with the Nazis. And he said, no, Paul, I didn't go to war for ideological reasons. I joined up because that's what young men did, and it was a big adventure.
Wow.
And you didn't have the courage to do it.
Wow.
So it was this very, I came from an environment where values and politics and principles were kind of charged. But I kind of reiterate, it's something when you come from a life of privilege, when you're on the beneficiary side of apartheid, you never quite realize what an oppressive regime is and how it operates and what it does until you see it in action. Yeah. And my kind of moment of real inflection was to see people being killed and abducted and disappeared and tortured. And then I had to make a decision. I'm either going to say, this is not the debating society that I thought it was and step away, or double down. And I think if I have great fortune in my life, I saw and was in the middle of a very evil moment, but then it changed.
Yeah.
And that also created this incredible moment of fertility and opportunity and optimism.
Yeah, well, let's go back to that, Matt. I think we definitely have lots of questions for you around that period. What would you like to pick up?
Well, you took us to the moment of Mandela coming to power and being asked to work alongside Archbishop Tutu. And you also characterized a little bit the sort of the puzzle that you were trying to solve there between the new regime post-apartheid and having a government of national unity. So what was it in the characteristics of the leaders, Tutu, Mandela, that you sort of took into your work? How did you take that leadership lesson? What did it look like up close and personal? Because everybody sees these iconic figures in history, but you were in the room with them.
Well, I'll tell you a story, if I may, about Tutu, which I think really sums up a kind of leadership lesson. So the way the Truth Commission worked is that we gave victims an opportunity to tell their stories, and they went first, and 24,000 victims gave us their testimony, and they painted a pretty horrific picture of what apartheid was and how it operated. And once you listen to those testimonies, the unavoidable question arose, which is, how did it happen? Who authorized it? Who knew what, when, at what level? Was this all just a case of a bunch of bad apples spontaneously all doing bad things, or was there some systemic authorization of what had occurred? And in order to get to the nub of that, we brought in all the top senior leaders of apartheid, and we questioned them about what they knew when, based on the data that we had received, both from victims, but also from perpetrators who had applied for amnesty. And the way the Truth Commission works, if you came forward and told the truth and disclosed everything, you could get off, but you had to tell the truth. So we had victim testimony, but we also had the truth provided to us by the people who did the killing. And that combination provided a pretty potent picture of the anatomy of violations and crimes. So I then, at age 26, had the task of preparing the questioning for our former Prime Minister, P.W. Botha, who was the hard man of apartheid. And he was due to appear before the Truth Commission, and I was due to lead the questioning. And the night before, I was in my office, and I received a phone call, and it was Archbishop Tutu, and he said, Paulus, he called me Paulus, how are you doing? And I said, Father, I'm fine, thank you, I'm a little bit nervous. He said, don't worry, I'm sure you'll do fine. He said, but I just have one message for you. And I thought he was going to give his classic words of encouragement. And he said, Paulus, if you humiliate the old man tomorrow, I will fire you. I was like, Father, if I may, in Romania, they took Ceausescu down to the basement and they shot him. In Nuremberg, they took people on trial and they hanged them. In the tribunals that have set up for Yugoslavia, they prosecute people and send them to jail for long periods of time. We're just having a nice conversation over a cup of tea. We need to get to the truth. He said, of course we need to get to the truth. But I repeat, if you humiliate the old man, I'll fire you. And that was a very interesting thing to say for a black South African who had been on the receiving end himself of this incredible system. He was concerned about his enemy's dignity. Now, what's really interesting about that story, almost spookily interesting, is that P.W. Botha defied the subpoena and didn't arrive. And so then we prosecuted him, not for the crime of apartheid, but for the crime of not appearing for a lawfully issued subpoena. We went to court, and I was then hauled out again to take all the questions I would have asked him had he arrived. And instead of having 2 hours to ask him gentle questions, I had then 2 days in court to make the case against the apartheid regime. It's all the questions I would have asked. So it was much worse for P.W. Botha, that option. But his entire defense through the entire time was, we didn't really want to ask him any questions. All we wanted to do was a witch hunt designed to humiliate him. So at the end of the trial, Archbishop Tutu went back into court, and the Attorney General, who was then handling the case, then said, could you tell me what you were doing the night before P.W. Botha arrived? And Archbishop Tutu said, I was at my thing. I said, what did you do? I said, I called Paul van Zyl, the Executive Secretary. Why did you call him? I was very concerned. I realized this would be a moment of national importance. And I was very concerned that Paul was a young man and he's a brilliant lawyer, but he might be intemperate and he might have used it as a moment to grandstand and to humiliate the former president. And even though we were on the opposite sides of history, it's very important to preserve people's dignity, because the new South Africa would not be possible unless we recognize each other's dignity. Now, firstly, that's remarkable. But secondly, Archbishop Tutu could not have known all of those series of events that would have led to him giving that testimony. And I often think about that as, if we think of the world that we live in today, polarized, pugnacious, trying to put people down, assassinate their characters, we don't pause and try and say, I listen to you, I understand where you come from, I appreciate your perspective. And those two men, Tutu and Mandela, just had dozens of ways in which they demonstrated that, in ways which were good for them, good for the country, but also good for humanity, I think.
Wow, that's extraordinary. So much to follow up on there. Just thinking about the context. So the fact that, the situation in South Africa was so egregious and the opportunity was so huge. To what extent do you think that context helped the people who end up in leadership roles to be their best selves? And to what extent do you think it is that those people had that innate ability and they would have shown up like that anyway?
I think certain human beings are born with incredible innate abilities, but I'm much more in the nature side of the nurture side of the nature debate, because actually, I was having a conversation yesterday at the Conduit, interviewing Jacqueline Novogratz, who set up the Acumen Fund, and we were talking about the state of the world, and she was reflecting on how in the last 25 years things have eroded, and in the last 5 years things seem to be eroding even quicker. And then we both had this moment of looking at each other and said, but in these moments of darkness and erosion and difficulty, often the greatest leaders are born because you are tested. You don't become fat, happy, and complacent. And I think in some ways, one of the reasons why you see a dearth of great political leaders in Europe right now, potentially, is that we've had years of prosperity and calm and peace. And that's meant that we've sort of technocratically measured, like wobbled along, but we haven't actually been tested by the grand challenges of our time. And apartheid produced an incredible evil, but it also created corresponding good.
It's interesting because I think, at a personal level, I think my reflection is it's often the toughest times when we grow the most individually, but your view on that at a country level is also clearly true from a really horrific time. I also think, though, there's a lesson in there about the Archbishop's input to you. You said, humiliate him and I'll fire you. Yeah. That's a really short bit of leadership input. You wouldn't necessarily associate an archbishop with a threat to fire, but it clearly had a powerful impact and just made you reframe your whole approach. And I think that's an incredibly striking thing when you look at leaders who've been able to set the tone for an entire country and for an entire generation. It's that sort of power of picking a moment and a really high impact message.
Yeah. Yes. And Mandela did a corresponding thing. It's weird. The Truth Commission, because it was about investigating the core of a nation's past and pulling back a curtain and looking into its soul, it had these sort of Greek chorus-like moments. But Mandela only appeared before the Truth Commission once. And didn't appear. He came to listen to testimony, and there was a day of testimony, and I was running the order of who would testify when. And as it happened, Mandela sat down, and then I said, this person should go next. And without any forethought or consciousness, I put forward a woman whose child had been blown up and killed by a bomb placed by the ANC, by the liberation movements. And Mandela's only experience in person of the Truth Commission was hearing how a party that he was the head of had killed, through the placing of an explosive in a shopping center, a woman's child, a clear violation of international humanitarian law. And, this is like saying the French resistance are the same as the Nazis, you're spending all the time on the French resistance but not spending the time on the Nazis, because the ANC were clearly generally an exemplary liberation movement. And Mandela was asked about this. He said, didn't you feel sabotaged or ambushed by the Truth Commission? And he said, I was extremely grateful to be able to listen to that testimony, because it's not the correctness of your struggle that you should spend all your time reflecting on. It's when you do things that violate your own principles and norms and have to think about, even though you're pursuing justice, you need to do it through just means.
Yeah.
Right? Now, who are these leaders? Who are these people who say these things?
Just the most incredible empathy
Exactly.
in the most extreme circumstances.
Well, you've said the E word, Matt, so I need to pick up on that. And I was thinking exactly the same. So I am mildly obsessed with the importance of empathy as a core part of leadership. And when I think about the way in which the leaders that we're discussing conducted themselves through this absolutely extraordinary and harrowing period, that is surely one of the qualities that they were able to exemplify. And I'm interested in your sense of, to what extent is empathy a key tool in navigating these transitional justice issues, and how, in practical terms, can you cultivate it? So, everyone comes to the table with their lived experience, with their prejudices, with their anxieties. How do you go from that point to creating an environment where there is a much greater degree of shared empathy?
So I'm a massive proponent of empathy as a kind of organizing principle of human existence, actually. And Mandela and Tutu had this idea of Ubuntu, this African principle that I am because you are. And the most valuable thing you can do is affirm the relationships between us as human beings and our reciprocal obligations towards each other. That the best societies have this deep web of bonds and connections between each other. Doesn't mean that you don't have individual responsibility, that you don't strive for excellence, that you don't place attention on individual liberty. It just means that you think about how you are in a society. And I think that the evidence is that the societies with high amounts of Ubuntu are happier, more resilient, more creative, more entrepreneurial, more philanthropic, are better able to weather crises, have lower transaction costs, have higher trust. So what you should be doing is teaching at an early age that we're Ubuntu, that we're webbed into each other. And I think You are more attached to leaders who show empathy. Your families are stronger. Your relationships are better. And I think there are loads and loads and loads of ways that you can model that in preschool, in school curricula. And if you abstract one level higher, people looked at Denmark during World War II. The Danes saved double the number of Jews per capita that anybody else did. They took people into their homes. And people said, what was going on in Denmark? And they then went and looked at it, and Danes had the sense of what they called metaphysical guilt. It's the guilt that you feel when someone else's rights are being violated and you do nothing. So when they didn't save people, they felt guilty. They felt like, oh, I'm doing something wrong because I'm obligated to save people. Now imagine if we all had more metaphysical guilt, right? We'd save more people's lives. We'd care more about the environment. It would be better in aggregate for all of us if we had more of this. So it's not I'm not being sort of preachy. I'm actually saying it's the highest form of enlightened self-interest is to assert empathy, because it will come back and benefit you 10 times out of 10.
And in this polarized world we live in, how do we do that, Paul?
I think the weird thing is that this polarized world we're in is a recent phenomenon. And I think it's recent, in my view, in part. I think a significant part of it is to do with information ecosystems for the first time in history, and you'll know this better than many, many, many others. The way we communicate with each other, the way we narrowcast, the way we're able to target has fractured us and polarized us. And I think if we just try and think our way out of it without thinking about the system and changing the way those systems work, we will be fractured. And then the second reason why we have the polarization is because for the last 25 or 30 years, the economic model, at least in the West, has broken down, and ladders of opportunity have broken down, and promises that people thought that you lived in a fair and equitable society have been broken. And if you marry that with our information systems, you're able to narrowcast to people and blame the actual injustice that they experience on other extraneous things like immigrants. And so we need to do the economic system and the information systems at the same time, but we'll do neither of those unless we get the Ubuntu and the empathy right. So it's like chicken and egg, but I bet that we start with Ubuntu.
I love the concept of Ubuntu, and I think you gave us some, the examples of like what's driving people to these extreme views, which is loneliness and economic disappointment. I think we see that around the world. But as Hayaatun was going towards you on this, what about at a personal level?
Yeah.
Like, talking about a societal level, what at a personal level, what ways have you, because you took what you learned and then you scaled it later to lots of countries. So what do you learn about how to create Ubuntu at a very personal level that perhaps people could take as something to do tomorrow?
I think in your leadership style, one of the things that I have tried to do, and we mention Ubuntu in all of our C-suite meetings at the Conduit. We have it as a company ethos, and we always say our role with each other is to be kind and compassionate, to put each other in each other's shoes, to correct rather than to criticize, to hold to delivery and to excellence, but to do this and to drive that down, not through a kind of top-down leadership style, but for everybody to embrace it. And I think one of the things about that is that if that culture sediments in an organization, most complex organizations have to be cross-collaborative and have to have teams that work with each other, people of similar statuses having to, be in each other's shoes. And if you as a leader have to intervene to break the tie or to sort those things out because people are not Ubuntu with each other, it's a wildly inefficient way of running a place. And actually, the company doesn't have joy and it's not efficient. So I think if you embody it in your C-suite, but also you drive it through the organization and tell people that that's what you expect and that's what the culture is, two things happen. you get better joy and more efficient decision making, for sure. You get more creativity because people are willing to share information. And then I think the final thing that happens is when people step outside the culture, you don't have to exercise HR top-down discipline because the culture swarms and they go, oh, that person's not being very Ubuntu. And that actually means that the institution swarms like a virus to protect itself. And I think that if you can do that in a company, there's no reason why you can't exemplify it more broadly in a society.
Thank you.
Well, this is so interesting. We're talking about really kind of meaty issues that are, going to be sort of in the annals of history for decades and for generations. But I want to again come back to the personal. So my family, I think, my father was from South Africa, and I know from personal experience that the people who were involved in the struggle against apartheid had to carry a very heavy toll on them and on their family. It was fundamentally unsafe, and people had to be, lightning rods for this incredibly kind of, tense and violent environment. So thinking about the time when you entered the struggle against apartheid and then through to this period of the Truth Commission, what was it like personally? Did you feel fearful? Did you feel overwhelmed at points? How did you navigate that?
I always say there were moments when, I was arrested, I was prosecuted, I was, a semi-automatic weapon was shot at a car that I was traveling in, was beaten and tear gassed, and, but you were always protected relative to black South Africans if you were a white South African. So it wasn't that white South Africans weren't killed, isn't that you can't be shot and prosecuted. We were, but the first thing I always say is that you are always in a different category. The logic of a racist state is that it wants to kill people that look like the racist state less than people who are the other. The thing that we did in the Truth Commission was because we had this deadly trio of lawyers, church people, theologians, and psychologists who ran the commission. You could imagine interesting group of and high-powered leaders all in one room, navigating the country's past. But they insisted that we have every Friday get together and have kind of therapy sessions and unburden ourselves and talk about what we were experiencing. The translators who translated the testimony of victims in the Truth Commission, their hair fell out. Their teeth fell out. They had extraordinary PTSD just translating the words. 8 of the 17 Truth Commissioners got cancer during the Truth Commission. Wow. So, I think it's hard. You underestimate the toll that trauma takes on the human body at your peril. And I think there's now a really compelling body of evidence that you have to deal with it.
So what about you personally? You did a marvelous job there of talking about
it's a really good
else.
question. So if I have to make a confession, I was a 26-year-old man, and I sort of thought I was robust enough, and I was mission driven, and I think during the Truth Commission I genuinely didn't pay enough attention to that.
And afterwards, did you? Just the processing of what you must have heard in court.
Yeah, how was the Paul at the end of the 3 or 4 year period different from the Paul at the beginning of that period?
I think what I came away from it was I need a break from this because I will go insane. So I went to New York. I did a master's in law. I went and worked for a year at a gigantic corporate law firm, and
can't imagine that.
And neither could anybody else. And
which was more traumatic?
Well,
don't trivialize this. Sorry,
no, it's hilarious. And I arrived at this law firm, and then 2 weeks after I arrived, a call from Madeleine Albright's office, who was then the the US ambassador to the UN said, we need Paul to go to Indonesia to go and help with the new transition there. And the managing partner at the law firm said, we're not going to see a lot of you, are we, Paul? And I said, I really hope not. So, I mean, it was preordained that I was going to go back and do that stuff. Yeah. But I think I had a year of studying in New York that felt like it was a luxury, a moment to take stock. But then I was very sure that what we had learned down in the bottom tip of Africa would be something that would be applicable elsewhere.
So let's take that moment then. So you've done this extraordinary process, the like of which the world had never seen before. Yeah. It's physically taken a huge toll on everyone. You've decompressed, but then you're being drawn into, how do we do this in all these other places with similar atrocities to resolve? So how did you sort of think about that request for you to rise again and to scale that to more people? And how did you go about it?
So my sort of mentor at the Truth Commission was the deputy head of the Truth Commission, a guy called Alex Perrain, who had been a very important figure in South Africa's white anti-apartheid politics. And we got so many requests to go to places that we, and this maybe is an interesting lesson, as we said, we're not going to just be lone rangers. We looked at each other and said, this is the 30th request we've gotten to go around the world and meet with people. The way you make change is you build institutions. And so we went then to the Open Society, to the Ford Foundation, to Atlantic Philanthropies, and we raised $25 million just in 3 meetings to build an institution that was capable of doing it. And then we went and hired the most extraordinarily brilliant people from all over the world. The most incredible Sri Lankan woman with a double PhD from Harvard and Oxford, and a really grumpy Scot who was completely brilliant, and a fantastic Dutch woman who worked for the tribunals, and an incredible Sri Lankan woman. And so we just got this 2 Sri Lankans, just incredibly gifted, thoughtful people. And then we just started deploying.
And Paul, just before you get into deploying, so what was it like? You got a load of money to do something, but it's something where there can't really be like a playbook. It's more, as you describe it, almost like a state of mind that you brought to the commission. So what was it you were getting these people to go forth into the world and actually do at the most human level?
So when Mandela was released in 1990, it was clear that we would need to have a transitional justice process to deal with the crimes. And because the elections only happened 4 years later, those of us who were in the kind of engine room, had this amazing luxury. I say luxury, it was the most extraordinarily violent and difficult part of South Africa's history. It got more violent when Mandela was released because the regime was trying to sabotage him. We could let's go to Chile and Argentina and Poland and Indonesia and elsewhere and study the transitions that had happened there, and then sort of take a smorgasbord approach, take the lessons that worked and didn't work in those places, and assemble something that would work. And all the people who came to South Africa at that time all said, we're here to help you learn, not make the mistakes we made. And so what we did from that moment is say, we want to replicate that. What the thing that made us successful is we never went into another person's country and said, this is what you should do. We said, we have no idea what you should do. What we can do is bring you a menu of global comparative experience and let you make your own more informed decisions. And firstly, people went, oh, thank God. Thank God you're not coming on a plane and shaking your finger and telling us what to do like white saviors. And secondly, that modesty of saying you're here to help, you're not here to preach, gave us a license to do this. And so we just got good reviews because we were smart. We had done it before in our own countries. And then as we went, we brought the most gifted people from those experiences. So the most smart Peruvian and Colombians, they joined the teams and they went on and spread the word. And they said, you always used to say, if you think we were sophisticated in South Africa, what the Peruvians did were twice as sophisticated. And it really was. I'm not being cute. So we could bring that kind of global experience to help people out.
It's such a heavy topic, isn't it? It's hard to hear some of those stories and the toll it took on people. But inevitably, there's humour in the darkest moments as well. And you're somebody who has just such a spirit of fun and a twinkle in your eye. Yeah. I can imagine that helped you to get through some of that time as well.
Well, I tell you a really funny story that happened you join the student movement and you are being sort of promoted up the ranks to into positions of greater seniority. And one of the great honors that you can get is you can be asked to address a mass rally. And, there's 10,000 people gathered at a rally and you're about to go march and confront the police. And the people who they choose to speak are the people who are the sort of, rising stars. So I got chosen to speak at one of these rallies, and I was both extremely nervous but very honored. And there's a group of 9,800 black South Africans and 200 white South Africans sprinkled in the front. And at the end of each speech, you give your speech and then you start going, Viva the revolution, Viva, and, Viva the spirit of no compromise, Viva. And I started doing this, and I was doing it, chanting in this very effective way, and the crowd was really getting behind me. And then what I did is I transposed. There was the Defiance campaign at that point in South Africa, which was, you'd say, Viva the spirit of defiance. And then there was Viva the spirit of no compromise. And I, in my moment of great enthusiasm, transposed them. And I shouted out at the top of my voice, Viva the spirit of no defiance. And I wrote, and this entire crowd of 10,000 people were about to go Viva. And then they paused. And then these peals of laughter went across all of them, and basically it was like this white guy he just can't get it right. He tried and he got it, and so I sort of slunk off the stage, and then I ran to be the president of the student council, and I was knocking on doors, 2 years later to get people's votes, and I would knock on the door and the person would open the door and say, "Oh, you're the Viva the spirit of no defiance guy. You've got our vote." So it's amazing how just one malaprop can stay with you for the rest of your life.
People remember when you make them laugh, exactly. Intentionally or otherwise.
Exactly.
Did you have moments of levity with Mandela or with Desmond Tutu that you can share?
Oh, Tutu was completely and utterly... Anybody who's listening or watching should type in Archbishop Tutu laugh. There is an entire archive of his most extraordinary laughs, and he would say things that were mischievous and wicked and break into laughter all the time. And so Bono came to visit us at the Truth Commission, and Archbishop Tutu would always, in the beginning of a meeting, we would hold hands and he would say a little prayer by way of starting. And sometimes he would do this really wicked thing where he would say, "Dear Lord, thank you very much for bringing us together, and so wonderful that Bono is here, such a wonderful musician, and he's come to our country to bless our work and bestow his words of wisdom. And it's also so wonderful that he will donate $2 million from the latest U2 concert to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission." And then he would pause, and then he would just go, "Wah!" and burst out into laughter. But he would let it go for about 10 seconds. You could see Bono completely panicking, because how can you not give $2 million to Archbishop Tutu when
what
he
a salesman? Yeah.
So he was just he would sort of he was not beyond a good prank.
Oh, that's awesome. So, having worked with such iconic leaders, were there other people that you encountered during your later career who were similarly inspiring or impactful for you?
Every country that you go to that's dealing with a history of mass atrocity has this cadre of people who've been forged in the furnace of that terrible time. And sometimes they ascend into government and are just these very inspiring, and sometimes they are unlikely people who get plucked out of these strange circumstances and become deeply historic. So there was a really amazing guy called Driss Ben Zekri who was Moroccan. And Morocco had a truth commission process where the current king, who is, descended from the prophet, and whose father was responsible for some of these terrible atrocities, was commissioning an investigation into his father's era as a way of trying to put the past behind him, but also not wanting to disrupt in any way the powers and prerogatives of the Moroccan royal house. And Driss said something. He was this incredibly articulate, fearless guy who had the confidence of the king, but also the confidence of the human rights movement. And he always said something that stuck with me, which was, when you're doing something of great consequence and you are trying to persuade people with power to do things that they are not sure they want to do, you have to sit on the red line between what's permitted and not permitted. And if you're over the line, you lose your job. And if you're away from the line, you're not pushing hard enough. So my job is to wake up every day and to sit on the red line. And I thought that was just a very astute observation about what achieving change really is. Because you've always seen in your life the people who are the rhetorical maximalists who always say you must do this and anything short of this is a cop-out or a sellout. And then the people who are the cop-outs and the sellouts. Yeah. But the people who sit on that red line are the most, I think, extraordinary people.
And Paul, you've gone on to have a big change in what you're doing now. You founded a club in London, the Conduit, which is about sort of social entrepreneurship a bit. So what led to that shift, and what is it you're trying to do as a leader now?
In a way, I think what the Conduit is seeking to do is scale and institutionalize Ubuntu. Because, so we have a 25,000 square foot building in the heart of Covent Garden. We bring together 150,000 people walk through the doors. We do 150 talks. We bring conferences together. But our real superpower is looking at really hard challenges and saying, who can we assemble from this extraordinary community into durable coalitions to tackle these problems at scale? And so, you will know that we're doing work on a thing called the Flood Action Coalition. Greatest near-term risk the UK is facing is £10 billion a year in flooding. The technologies that we used to have we can't afford and are not effective, so dams and walls. But we have this remarkable natural resource. We can build wetlands and riverine restorations and leaky dams. They're a sixth of the price. They're just as effective. And they produce these remarkable climate co-benefits. They sequester carbon. They promote biodiversity. And so you can bring them into being. You can finance them from existing revenue streams. And you can create new revenue by monetizing the carbon co-benefits. But you can't do something at scale with that level of complexity without creating Ubuntu. You need landowners, you need investors, you need ecologists, you need the National Trust and the Rivers Trust, you need the Environment Agency, you need DEFRA, you need banks like UBS, you need insurers like Aviva, you need technology companies like Google. And the innovation required to solve these at scale requires an orchestrator, and that's what we do. And it's sort of like going back home, actually. I feel like I'm able to do what like Mandela and Tutu would be going, like, do more of that, because it's bringing together people who share things and are generous with each other, but are solving things. We're not just admiring the problem. We're going, time's short, times are hard, let's go and do this.
I was thinking about how I would describe you if I sort of kind of come up with an alternative job title and what you do. And I had thought, well, how about purpose doula, as in, like a midwife? And now I think it has to be Ubuntu doula. This is what I'm going to use as my description. I don't know how you feel about that, Paul. But
it's a gender term, and I'll embrace it. It's I think women leaders are infinitely more effective than men in almost everything. So yeah.
It's fascinating listening to you because I think, we're all about trying to understand how to lead in this crazy, uncertain world. It's more unpredictable than it's ever been. But your leadership journey started in the most extreme sort of circumstances. And what you've learned, I think, seems incredibly relevant to leaders of today. We could all be a bit more Ubuntu, and rising leaders need to step up and play their part too.
I think that's right. And I think we're in those moments. I feel like the moment we're in right now is like the moment before Brexit, when everybody thought it couldn't happen and then it did. The moment before irreversible climate change, that people think, oh, it's not going to happen, and then it does. I think that the prospect of serious global conflict it's not unimaginable. And serious disruptive economic change as a result of AI and other forces is, it's not fanciful. And so we're in this sort of slow motion, quiet before the storm. Things haven't quite hit us, but they could. And I think at these moments, there are times which we have to sort of not be complacent. I think that complacency is the real challenge that we had. We need leaders who are not complacent. We need corporate leaders who rise to the challenge. We need civil society leaders who are not satisfied by just, growing what you do by 10% every year. We need step change. And I think that sense of urgency married with optimism is actually, it's the optimism that makes the urgency not feel daunting. I think we have no excuse not to be doing it, given what we all know.
Wow, that is a powerful place at which to end the bulk of the conversation. But Paul, I hope you're aware that we always like to end with a speed round. So you've done all the hard questions on this. This is now going to be an opportunity to do
Be afraid. Be very afraid.
Speed round. Those are terrifying speed rounds.
Don't worry. There are no right answers to this. And if you need a minute to think, do think. But we're looking for answers of a sentence at most, if possible.
Yeah.
So I have heard that you quite like a shimmy on the dance floor. So I want to know, what piece of music makes you leap out of your seat and get onto that dance floor?
I will do any U2 song.
Ah.
And I still...
Is that because you're sponsored by Bono?
Bono is a controversial figure, but I will do any U2 song. I still haven't found what I'm looking for is, still one of those songs that I was actually at a U2 tribute band in Dublin about 3 weeks ago, and I had a really wonderful time.
I mean, when you're going to the tribute bands, then you are a true believer. So that is good to know. You've worked with obviously extraordinary leaders. We've been discussing that. But what's the most unexpected source of leadership wisdom that you've come across?
Oh, wow. I think that, I keep going back to it, but I think that domestic workers in South Africa have this frank, direct way of speaking to people. And in the old days, they raised an entire generation of people. And so I think that the sort of black matriarchs in South Africa were always, they were infallibly wise.
I hear you. So I think we've all walked away with the sense that we need more Ubuntu in our lives. Beyond that, is there any kind of universal lesson you can abstract from all this extraordinary work you've done, particularly on transitional justice, that you think is relevant to anybody who's thinking about leadership?
Because it's the lightning round, I'm going to say never. One of my mottos in life is never make human beings choose between ethics and desire. Nice. Because they'll always choose desire. So what you have to do is make what's ethical desirable. And I think that also allows you to put like essential human impulses like love and pleasure and gratification into things that are earnest.
I like that.
Yeah.
That's deep. So next I'm going to ask you, in a working week, what makes your blood pressure go up?
If my to-do list grows.
And what do you do to bring your blood pressure down, apart from tackle your to-do list?
Cook.
And what gives you your highest high when you're at work?
I love watching an idea turn into something specific. So I love going, we dreamed up something 6 months ago and it landed. That idea manifested itself and it changed something. And so I'm always I get kind of slightly sweaty palms when I see that about to happen.
Excellent. Did you want to come in there, Matt?
Yeah, I've got a question
You've got
for you.
sweaty palms as well?
Always. Pass the mic. Nominate another guest who you think we could learn from.
Can I do two?
Yeah.
Yes.
I think Jacqueline Novogratz is wonderful. And the Acumen's just had its 25th anniversary, and she has a lot of thoughts and reflections and wisdom and battle scars along the way. I'm also a great fan of Dani Shrishkandaraja, who has been in leadership positions in lots of different places and is, I think, insightful and brilliant and challenging.
Excellent.
Thank you.
I'm going to seize the mic back again here. What's your most embarrassing moment as a leader? We want confessions.
Aside from mischanting in front of 10,000 people.
I mean, that was a good one, I must say.
I've got another one, actually. I was in Ghana, and I was helping with the Truth Commission process there, and I was put on breakfast television to be interviewed on the Good Morning Accra, show. And I was with my three colleagues, Vasuki Nasaya, Eric Darko, and myself. Eric is Ghanaian, Vasuki is Sri Lankan, and I'm South African. So we get into the makeup booth, and being Ghanaian television, the kind of the what's it that you the thing that you tell me what you use to sort of
foundation,
yourself, the foundation.
I love that Matt answered that.
Yeah.
Well done. That's so
He's
great.
a big fan of foundation.
I always wear makeup.
So the foundation went from very, very dark to sort of, cappuccino, but definitely not like for a white South African. So the kind of makeup artist very gingerly took the cappuccino and put it on me and basically turned me like 4 shades darker, like some kind of spoof from it. So firstly, I have this interview in which I look utterly ludicrous. But then having done the interview, I completely forgot that I had it on, and then went to go meet the Ghanaian Minister of Foreign Affairs in what is equivalent blackface. And he found it. It took him about 10 minutes to stop laughing. So it was a really good way to start the day.
Well, you have done very well to provide us with two very, very concrete stories of your embarrassment as leader. So I feel like we should probably draw this to an end. You've been generous. What do you know now that you wished you'd known earlier? I
think as a leader, I think that I've learned never respond when you're angry or frustrated.
Okay.
Always spend at least a day reflecting. And then the second thing I've learned is, as a leader, always follow the second and third bounce of the ball. So when you do X, think, how is that likely to be received? How is that person likely to act? What are they likely to do? And if they do that and that's undesirable, then why am I saying that? So maybe I recalibrate, because what I've done is I've anticipated second and third order consequences of what I've done. And so I think both of those are sort of signs of kind of reflection and maturity and impulse control, which is not my natural state of being.
I'd say there's a stretch goals for me too, yeah.
Well, great words of wisdom to end on, and we're always learning. Every day's a school day. So thank you so much, Paul. Really an extraordinary discussion and a very humbling one. And we've really enjoyed learning so much more about you than we knew at the start.
Thank you, Paul.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Actually feeling quite emotional after that, Matt.
Yeah. I mean, such a serious set of topics, but so many incredible lessons for life and leadership, and also the role of laughter in connecting with people and getting through some of those tough times. Massively incredible examples of people he'd learned from. I mean, Tutu and Mandela is on everybody's kind of dinner conversation list as some of the most inspiring leaders the world's seen.
Absolutely, and he wears that experience very lightly, and I guess that's part of what it's like to do such an extraordinary job so young. You almost don't know what you don't know.
I think that really struck me as well. He was so youthful that he was able to kind of play such a critical role in such a heavy environment, and that seemed to propel him as well on a mission in life.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it is basically a modern miracle that essentially was a peaceful transition post-apartheid in South Africa. And I remember, sort of seeing the before and the after, and it's just so hard to compute that this is in living memory. But I thought it was a brilliant example of the fact that there is always light and shade. Even when you're in your darkest moments, there is always light. And that might come from being inspired by people and his comments around who inspired him. Yes, he worked with the most senior leaders, some of the most famous leaders in history, but he was also inspired by domestic workers and the kind of the dignity. Actually, that word came up a lot, didn't it?
I think also I heard a lot the connection between the macro, the country level, the civilization level issues, and the very personal. And you pursued that question of empathy and how it's built, and trust on an individual level, but also in a nation going through a process, and then across 30 or 40 different nations as well. And I think those lessons, the word of the day obviously is Ubuntu, and that kind of sense, I am who I am only because of the we that we're part of. And I think that's really important today in this world of complexity, and we talked about that.
So remember to keep in touch with us. You can find us at What We Don't Know at boxlight.io, and you can find us on all the social feeds. You know where they are, and we really look forward to hearing from you. We love your questions, we love your comments. Tell us who you want to hear from, tell us what you want us to talk about. Thank you so much.